First, I'd like to turn it over to Steve, maybe, and we'll work our way to Amy, just to comment some general observations on the speakers and the state of things here in the North Bay, or Bay Area.
Happy to, Grace. And if I could just say two quick things at the outset. The first is, as you all now know, I'm going to need to buckle the seatbelt on this little Austin Powers chair when Jake McKenzie becomes my chairman in a few months. And secondly, is there anyone here from Chicago? Anyone here from Chicago?
Sure.
Well, we're coming back to Wrigley, just so you know, okay? Series is not ending here.
Thank you, Steve.
I've been
Amy?
Yeah. At least you read my introduction before I talked. Okay. I like that.
I'll work on my act here.
You know, I've been an avid reader of Kim's articles ever since she's been writing them. And this PowerPoint I liked even better. And I think she put her finger on the two most important political figures in our state in the last probably 70 years on the question of growth. And one of them is Pat Brown, who, if you're an infrastructure guy like me, you know, he is your hero. He's the guy who built our state highway system, built the university system, built the water network. And back when Pat was governor, California became the largest state in the union. It hadn't been up to that point. It was New York. And he celebrated the fact that we were becoming the largest state in the union. And there is probably very few political figures who would celebrate that level of growth anymore. In fact, there are plenty of them who want to toss all that growth out and not grow at all, including probably in his darker moments, his son, who is now the governor of California again. The other, and this is something that maybe a lot of you not from California are less aware of, is Howard Jarvis. And I was hoping there would be boos and hisses when his picture came up on the screen, but maybe everyone's too young. So let me remind you, you know, Howard Jarvis basically was the guy who pioneered the free lunch in our politics. We're going to cut all these property taxes and nothing bad will happen because government is bloated, it's full of waste, fraud, and abuse, and all will be well. And in part, his prophecy has turned out to be true because what happened after Prop 13 passed is all that sales tax revenue all that property tax revenue went away. The state replaced it with sales tax money, which fiscalized our land use decisions. So instead of wanting houses because they came with property tax, you wanted auto dealerships because they came with sales tax. And housing became a loser, sales tax became a winner, and commercial development. And that, to me, is one of our original sins in California. And for those of you who don't know, Ronald Reagan basically just took that show on the road. And we have been dealing with that vexing problem in our national and state politics ever since, when the voters are told you can have all the services you want and big tax cuts and there's going to be no problem at all. And to me, that's just the big lie. You get what you pay for out of anything in life, including government. And so, Kim, thank you for highlighting that point. You know, Carol, I think, raised the point with housing that a lot of us transportation folks in the room have some trouble with. And that is, you know, for some time now in the transportation community, we've been having a debate about supply, right? Can we build our way out of congestion? And look, the fact is, here in California, it wasn't really Jerry Brown who gets the bum rap. It was Ronald Reagan again who really stopped building the highway program that Pat Brown had started. And a lot of people thought, well, maybe that's not so bad, we'll build transit supply instead. And to some extent, we've reached the limits of that in our region, and Grace pointed out we need to reinvest in our BART system now, just as much, if not more, in fact, than we need to worry about outward expansion. And so this conflict that we've had in transportation with supply, you know, is, I think, a real one and is a nuanced debate. But I do think there is a lot less nuance in the housing debate. We need to build, and I think that was one of Carol's main messages. We have simply stopped building enough supply for it to affect the price of the product at all. And we are so far behind now, decades behind, that we will need to build for decades at elevated levels to even get some kind of sensitivity, some kind of balance between price, between supply and demand. We do need to make sure that some of that we build is affordable, but I think we fall into the trap, and this is a perfect Bay Area game. You know, whenever we answer multiple choice questions in the Bay Area, our favorite answer is none of the above, right? And what we've got out there now is a debate that says we need to build more housing supply or we need to subsidize housing, both existing and new housing. And if we can't do one, we can't do the other. And the fact is, of course, we have to do both. And until we wake up out of this debate where we think that if we only do one and not the other, all will be well, I think we're still behind the 8 ball. So to some extent, I think our transportation debate has evolved a little bit further than our housing debate. And I think one of my challenges, since I'm the guy overseeing this staff consolidation that James mentioned between our housing and transportation authorities, is to see whether we can catch the housing debate up and catch some of the housing solutions up to where we are in transportation.
So Steve, we've had this discussion, you and I have had this discussion. I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that. So if we're going to match up housing and transportation, I have workers at BART that earn $100,000, $80 to $120,000 a year, and they live in Tracy, which is over the hill in another region. It's in the San Joaquin Valley, for those not here. I have people that commute for 2 hours to get to a BART job. Now, they worked for BART for a long time. Some of them lived there before. Some of them bought property there before. But I think that the problem is growing beyond the Bay Area, that the housing solution for San Francisco is BART. You live at Oakland or someplace further out. And the housing solution for Oakland and other areas, maybe to the east, is San Joaquin Valley. So where's the planning that's going to help that relationship?
Well, Plan Bay Area that you mentioned, Grace, is required, in fact, by state law to plan enough housing in our region to prevent that problem that you cite from getting worse. And in fact, the number of people who do commute into our region from outside of the 9 counties is still relatively small compared to the number of people who are commuting inside the region. But it is, to me, a canary in the coal mine, because what it's saying is, you know, there's the old joke in the Bay Area that everything to the east of you is sprawl, right? So I live in San Francisco, so Berkeley is sprawl to me. And to Carol, you know, Dublin is sprawl, and the folks in Dublin, it's Tracy. And our job now, I think, is to build enough housing for the people who work here. And it's easy enough for us to say we love the jobs, look at all those figures Kim showed us, but we'll let the houses go somewhere else. In fact, the mayor of Brisbane said that in so many words just the other day. This is a small community just south of San Francisco that essentially wants to add a bajillion square feet of office space and 0 houses to go along with it. That's the attitude that we've got to confront and defeat if we're going to make some headway here. And I think that's the kind of mobilization we need, Grace, really to build the kind of housing infrastructure we need in the Bay Area to deal with our growing workforce.
Okay, before, I just want to follow that thread for a minute. Amy, you're going to get the next one up, but I'd like to turn to our two panelists. Do you think there's hope in the future in California to address this ongoing conflict that's there, that's been driving us to, Steve and Kim, between the two of you, did a nice job explaining why we're in the pickle we're in, but it's not to a city's advantage or any governmental unit's advantage to have housing come in. They prefer to have the jobs. So is there hope in the future there?
So, you know, I would say this, that's why I put out there that we are at this moment in time where we are doing some good incremental things, and we need to continue to do some of those. So just as an example, maybe we can't totally reform Prop 13 today, which would start to shift this attitude.
In what manner? What would you change about it? If you couldn't repeal the whole thing, what would you change about it?
So an example of something you could do incrementally is you could have a much greater transfer tax or capital gains tax on people's equity. And let's put that, so you and I probably, I certainly am quite advantaged by having bought my home in the Bay Area on one of those people who parents might have bought a home for $5,000. That same house today is worth $2 million, right? I didn't earn that. I didn't do anything to create that value. So I should be taxed on that when it's time to leave that house in a way where, yes, I still earn some equity, but that some of that equity goes into a fund that helps create the infrastructure for more housing and actually creates an incentive in some ways, which is what Prop 13 doesn't do, for mobility, for people to move. And I do think that that's an example of something you could do short of overturning Prop 13. Not that we shouldn't be looking at that as well.
Kim.
I mean, I'm at least pretty pessimistic in the medium term because it's such an entrenched law. Like if you look at the southern suburbs, Cupertino, Menlo Park, and Mountain View's improving, but those are where like Facebook, Alphabet, Google, and Apple are based. I mean, Cupertino just approved AC2 a couple years ago. That's 14,000 workers on a site that used to have 4,000 workers. They are not adding really any housing, in part because the voters there has a very high-performing public school district, so a lot of the voters and the parents there are very concerned about impacts on the schools. If you look at Palo Alto, the mayor of Palo Alto, Palo Alto is the birthplace of Silicon Valley. It's where the HP garage was, created like a century ago. The mayor of Palo Alto recently said, the way to solve our housing crisis is by destroying jobs, essentially, or like cutting back on jobs. And so I think it's structurally really difficult. And then on top of that, if you look at the Bay Area's governance structure, there's 101 cities here, there's 9 counties. Apple, pays its taxes in terms of property, corporate tax, business fees, et cetera, go to the city of Cupertino. But if you look at its worker base is 25% in San Jose, it's 14% in San Francisco. There's no way for San Francisco or San Jose to collect any of that because we're separate municipalities. And then on the other hand, if you look at Cupertino, Apple is basically making up, a fifth to a third of its municipal budget. And you as a municipality, you don't want to be 1/3 dependent on a single revenue source. That's really terrible from a financial diversification perspective. And as someone who grew up down there a generation ago, I remember in the 1990s when Apple was run by Gil Amelio before Steve Jobs came back, and they were doing terrible, and the city of Cupertino had to cut them a sales tax break because they were doing poorly. And so you have this kind of taxation system which is divided between so many different cities, isn't collected in a way that can lead to better infrastructure. And then in terms of the voter population, a lot of these other suburban areas which do the worst job at the jobs housing imbalance, they're all majority property owner voting districts. So they don't really necessarily have a particular individual incentive to add more housing because it's to their financial benefit that they don't as individual property owners.
So can I just one more
Yes, and then
response?
we want to include
Yeah. Part of the reason I'm optimistic is because of people like you. So you get it. You're talking about it. We're talking about it at the university. We're putting out these, that map that the LAO did that you showed of, I think it was Los Angeles, right? A neighborhood in Los Angeles where the property taxes are, all inequitable depending on when you bought your house. I just think that we're going to have a generational shift here where folks are going to get that this is not sustainable. The baby boomers are no longer the largest generation, right? The millennials are the largest generation, and that's going to change the dynamics of this conversation. And I think we're going to be reaching a tipping point here pretty soon.
Amy, do you think that the changes that Carol's describing are going to come fast enough for you to be able to provide housing in some reasonable, foreseeable future?
Yeah, let me see if I can take a stab at that. And just to say that it's a real honor to be up here with these panelists and here with you today. And it's such a difference from, say, watching television last night. We're not pulling each other. We're not interrupting. There's just this high level of discourse about real issues. So as I was coming here today, I can tell my transportation story here, but there was like, I got a seat today. It was so early on the BART. But just that it's a great reminder that there is hope. We have these ideas. We can come up with solutions to big, challenging problems. And it isn't just one silver bullet, but it's lots of these kinds of strategy sessions. And I would say we have a paradox, because from a climate change perspective, from a transit perspective, from a rationality perspective, we need to rearrange how we are continuing to grow in the region. And so we have Plan Bay Area, we have a focus where you're concentrating developments in places that's where we need to grow. And yet, what happens to the land value in those places? It goes up. What happens when you concentrate development in the cities? The cost of that development goes up. You're generally building up, and you're building more densely, and the cost of that is going up. At the same time, who's living in those communities now? They are not empty. They are largely low-income communities and communities of color. Some of them are historic African American communities, historic Chinese communities, historic Latino communities, and they are going to be the front line of bearing the brunt of what we want to do, which is concentrate development near transit and have sustainable development. And yet, time after time after time in history, what do we see? That lower income communities, that communities of color bear the brunt of that growth, even if it's the smart growth that we want. It's not necessarily equitable growth. And the market by itself, I absolutely agree with Carol, the market by itself is not going to build for the most vulnerable communities. We know that we need government solutions to come in and help to make sure that we are addressing the needs of the most vulnerable. And at the same time, what is the market building? With all of the system that we have now, it's building luxury housing. And the way that any project is going to be able to pencil out near BART station in San Francisco or in Oakland or San Jose or other areas where we're targeting development is to go luxury. So how to get to that missing middle is still that vexing challenge, is still that, how are we going to do that even if we say we want to grow supply, it is going to continue to be an equitable supply. And we are never going to be able to subsidize enough to really make a difference with the larger systems of inequities in this country. And so, housing is a manifestation of so many other things. But really, let's look at the income divide, and let's look at what happened after the foreclosure crisis, when our whole financial system around real estate was restructured. And what happened is that wealth was taken from communities who have held their homes for many, many years. Often that asset that helped African American communities, Latino communities build wealth in this country that was taken from them. And where did that wealth go? It didn't just disappear. It got concentrated and accumulated in certain segments of our economy, and it turned around and became international and institutional investors in real estate. And so there are a number of these patterns. So I think that we have to deal with regulation and fix regulation. We have to deal with inequities in the broader real estate system. And we cannot wait to deal with the issues of equity and how do we get to affordability. And just the last thing that I'll say right now, which is totally agreeing with Carol about these game-changing solutions and when voters get it. Right now, voters get it. This is the first time in my 20-plus years here in the Bay Area where we do not have to explain the affordable housing crisis. Even Steve Heminger, I'll quote him, said, we have a transportation problem in the Bay Area, but we have a housing crisis in the Bay Area. People really get it. And in fact, we're seeing that in the polls where we've done a number of opinion polls. And voters are saying that the vast majority of people are saying that it's very difficult to find a place to live. It's very difficult to put a roof over our head. And people are thinking about themselves, they're thinking about friends and family, and they're thinking about vulnerable communities. And this is another hopeful thing, there's so much compassion out there in the general public that it's not all the kind of bullies that we can sort of imagine in our head from certain public figures. But that 90% of people polled said they support affordable housing for veterans and seniors. 85% support housing for low-income families and getting people off the streets. So there is that commitment that is out there. And what my organization is doing is putting forward big game-changing solutions around ballot measures, that voters need to vote to invest in affordable homes. And so we have 3 different counties that will be voting for affordable housing in November, in addition to other things that might be happening at the November elections. They'll be voting for affordable housing, and we hope that those are going to set the pace and the change for that continued commitment, that continued investment in affordable homes.
So Amy's mentioned public subsidy. So we vote as voters to put some tax money in to subsidize housing. You talked about other game-changing ideas. I've been here 5 years, and when I came, we've been dealing with the governor's taking away the redevelopment agencies that were also a help. They provide a little bit of grease as the different pots of money were coming together to help development around BART stations, as an example. So where's the hope? Where do you see the hope besides public subsidy of affordable housing? Because I think there's a lot of reason to support it, and I think particularly from a race point of view, you mentioned young white workers. You specifically said young white workers are coming in over here. What about young black workers? What about Hispanic families and African American families that are here in the Bay Area that are working class? They've got jobs. They're teachers. They're firemen or they fight fires, firefighters. They don't see themselves as qualifying for public assistance for housing, right?
Right, and
Okay.
many of them don't. It's
Right.
that missing middle that we've talked about.
Right.
So I think Amy's hit on a really good point, that you've got right now subsidies for people who are low income that people are willing to tax themselves for, and do bond measures, et cetera. And it's not enough, but you've got some of that. But this missing middle.
So if you stop right there, Howard Jarvis's idea of a good time is taxes going down. We're now raising our taxes to provide for the housing, the cycle that
Well, it's a question
Kim
of like
began.
what type of taxes you have, and so in kind of undercutting the property tax base, if you look at the tax structure of the state of California, it's very structurally dependent. Cities are structurally dependent on sales taxes and fees, which are regressive and impact lower income workers more. And then on the other hand, at the state level, we have the higher kind of marginal income tax rates in the U.S., which are very progressive, in line with rising income inequality in California. However, the trade-off for the higher level of income and capital gains taxation is volatility and unpredictability in the state budget. And so, like, if you look at the California state budget, we're kind of effectively tied to whatever the U.S. stock market is doing. And when we go into a down cycle, the state budget can decline by more than $20 billion or more dollars in like a single year. And so there's this tension, which was definitely on display this last year, between the showdown between Governor Jerry Brown wanting to have by right or streamlined kind of permitting for housing that matched existing zoning without any kind of discretionary review or appeal, in exchange for $400 million in low-income housing funding. And originally, David Chu and I think Phil Ting, they were asking for $1.3 billion. Governor only offered $400 million. People thought that was way too low because the cost of building a single unit in the state can vary considerably. Like for the Mission project that I mentioned in my presentation, that's about $300,000 per unit in local city taxpayer subsidy. And so if you're thinking about $400 million, that's not very many units. But you can also see from Governor Jerry Brown's perspective, if in the last cycle, on a downturn, we dropped by tens of billions of dollars in a single year on the budget, you can also understand where his fiscal caution and conservatism is coming from. And so that's the essential trade-off we're trying to ask, which is, given the tax structure that we have, which is really volatile, and the affordability crisis, where's the balance between the two?
Can I just go just on some solutions that I think are imminently doable, right? Because we have to take some steps. So one is, Oakland just did this, which is deciding not to have the same, to lower their parking ratios in their downtown area. So one of the problems that Amy mentioned is that we're building too much luxury housing. I would argue that outside of San Francisco, we are not really building luxury housing. We are building housing that costs a lot because that's what it costs to build. And the developer isn't going to build that new supply, unless he or she can get, rents to cover those costs. So if you lower the costs for that market rate housing by, for example, changing some of your local code requirements, your parking ratios, communities can help get more of that supply that costs less to build and therefore can be rented for a less amount. So that's
Some of those local code requirements are things this audience has probably advocated for themselves. You want us to lower the energy code requirements?
No, I mean, I think there's, let me give you a simple.
I got the parking, but name some others.
Simple things like, we had a big fight in the 1990s over, cast iron pipe versus plastic pipe. It took 30 years to get building officials to say, yeah, plastic pipe is okay. It costs half as much and it does just as good. So there are material things like that we as Californians should really be looking at. The other one I would just mention, and I'm involved in some innovation around this, is off-site modular construction built here in the USA, in California, so we're not offshoring jobs. You can cut the time to build by 40%, which cuts money, and you can cut the cost by 20%. It's proven. It's not easy to do, but again, I think we're at a tipping point where you are going to see a lot more modular construction, off-site modular construction get to lower costs.
Steve.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in incentives. And Carol had a slide up that mentioned one of our programs that provides incentives called OBAG. And that program basically is a trade-off between the transportation agency and local government. And what we ask of them is that if we give them some money, we'd like to see them, for example, comply with state law, which requires each of them to have a housing element approved by the state of California. And before we started this program, we've got 100 cities in the region, 20 of them didn't do it. Whether they were blowing it off or whether they were just forgetful, I don't know what it was, but they didn't do it. After we started this incentive program, we were down to 1 within a space of 6 months. And I kick myself, frankly, because I think we probably could have asked them for more and they would have done it. Kim mentioned earlier that Cupertino's budget is a third coming from Apple. And trying to pry that out of them and share it with other communities on the peninsula, for example,
they also want more.
Is going to be pretty darn tough. But that does say that 2/3 of their budget doesn't come from Apple. And I think a lot of cities in our region, some of them perhaps are acting selfishly. But I think a lot of them are acting rationally based upon the system of incentives they have. And if we can change those incentives, for example, if our sales tax in California applied to services, not just goods, and that new pot of money could be allocated in such a way to upend the incentives we have against housing, I think we can make some real headway. So I do think the incentive discussion can bear a lot of fruit. And look, the best money is new money because no one has their claim on it yet. But even with existing money, which is what we did with OBAG, I think you can alter incentives as you go and get better outcomes.
We only have a few minutes left, actually 1.5, I think. So I'm going to ask each of you, where's the hope? Where's the hope? And we've talked a lot about housing here. Most of this audience came mostly based on transportation. And so where's the hope for transportation providers and local officials? There's local officials in the audience here.
I think the Bay Area.
You've already confessed you're a little depressed about the whole thing.
Oh, no, in terms of transportation,
okay.
I don't know. I'm very curious to see, as I said in my presentation, the technology industry likes to devise its own solutions and circumvent systems. And one of these experiments is on display right now as we speak. I don't know. I'm concerned about how it will turn out in terms of transit equity, but it's very curious what all of these companies in the Bay Area are doing as the automobile industry shifts from the center of power shifts from Detroit to here, and what happens in terms of autonomous vehicles. and what that does to the landscape and shape of the Bay Area, what it does in terms of distributing pressures on land values and land costs around the region, and perhaps even away from traditional fixed line. I'm not saying that is a utopian solution. I'm very cautious, I guess, about both public and private approaches to transit in general. But I do think that's very interesting, and it is a solution that the industry, particular companies here in the Bay Area feeling the stress of the current situation have come up with, and we'll see how it ultimately gets integrated.
So I'd like you and Steve then to both answer this as you give your comments. I think you're the one Kim, that mentioned that the 7th largest transit provider in the area are private buses.
Yeah.
So, and
that was a Bay Area Council study, or were you guys part of that?
Too.
That was part of you. Okay.
Yeah. So our 7th provider of transit, and these are, for those of you that don't live in this area, we call them Google buses, and they're big white buses, and this long line of fairly white people stand in line usually.
Yes, yes.
And then they get on and they have their coffee or mocha or whatever, and they get on the bus and it's all Wi-Fi'd up, and the seat is cushy. It's not like BART where you can smell the 6 people that you're touching. And so I appreciate to no end the pleasantries of it, but they have the salary to afford housing. Now they're provided their subsidized transit here, and life must be nice for them, but what about the rest of the Bay Area?
I wish that, I think we have 100 miles of, New York City has 800 miles of subway rail, and we have 100, we just totally, because of the governance structure, we totally miss,
Is it success that the 7th largest
provider
provider
I don't feel great about that, no.
Okay.
We should just have awesome public transit, so.
Where's the hope, Carolyn?
So, I think I said, I think there's hope in the next generation, but really I think the hope is this, and we've had some of this conversation. It's always darkest before the dawn, and it's pretty dark. And
You're just a born optimist. That's the answer to that question.
I really do think, Amy talking about voter sentiment is an important signal. The generational shift is an important signal. And the fact that I can't go anywhere without having this conversation. And we're really talking about actual solutions.
So awareness.
Yes, absolutely. And education and factual, evidence of the problem.
Amy, where's the hope?
I'll get back to the voter opinions and some of the messaging. So what are some of the strongest messages? And I'll tell a brief, quick story here. So one of the strongest messages out there that voters resonate with is that children deserve the opportunity to succeed in school and life, which begins with a stable home. Another one is that this measure will make sure that the chronically homeless, mentally ill, and veterans have a place to live and services they need. Another one is hardworking people should be able to live in a safe, decent, affordable home and still have enough money for groceries and other basic necessities. So some of the message there is we're painting a picture. We're talking about real people. We're talking about our kids. We're talking about our neighbors' kids. We're talking to people that we know in the community, and that we're talking about what matters to us. What are those values? And it's a very values-driven conversation that people are resonating to. Yes, this is the Bay Area, but there are still lessons for around the country about how to tell the story. But for the transit people in the room, I want to share another message that resonates maybe not as strongly because it's a little less about people and children and seniors, but it's that it's better for society, the environment, and families if people can afford to live close to where they work. This measure will build affordable housing close to transit, which will reduce traffic congestion, pollution, and commute time. And that received wild support among voters. Maybe it was, again, a little bit less strong than talking about people, but these are messages. We are being successful in our work and getting things across, and we have to keep putting forward these big solutions, and we have to keep, it's not, the tinkering around the edges is not what people want. We need big, bold solutions. Yes, they sometimes wind up in terrible battles, but we have to keep at it. And I think that whatever happens on November 8th, it's going to be really interesting on November 9th, and we're going to have to all fight like hell to make sure that our values stay out there and present and strong and keep growing.
So before we get to Steve, Amy, I think there's a lot of housing that's on the ballot that you've talked
Yeah.
about. But there's a lot of transit out there that's a little
Absolutely.
beleaguered trying to carry all of these people, the people that aren't standing in the Google bus line.
Yes.
And Steve, I want you to tell us what's the hope on the transit side and what's the hope with the privatization of transportation that's gone on.
Well, you know, I think it's pretty hard to live in the Bay Area and be a pessimist, so I'm really going to work on bucking Kim up. I mean, look, this city recovered. The city you're sitting in recovered from a fire and an earthquake that burned half the city down in 1906. We built those two bridges up there, the Golden Gate and the Bay Bridge, in the depths of the Great Depression. The innovation in the Silicon Valley economy that Kim highlighted is a wondrous thing. It's not a downside. Now, we have some catching up to do to deal with our success. But as you said in your opening, Grace, I mean, there are plenty of people here on the search for success. I would rather be the guy who's got it and is dealing with the problems that associate with it than looking for the kind of economic development that a lot of communities across America are doing. I mean, I'll conclude on the tech shuttles. I don't feel bad about them at all. It is a circumvention around government. The fact is, the Caltrain service, which serves that peninsula, is crammed to the gills just like BART is. And at some point, if a private employer with their own dough wants to run their own bus and get a bunch of people to work without having them drive their cars, doesn't bother me. Now, I don't think that's a workable model to replace our transit infrastructure, but I really don't think those shuttles are displacing much transit infrastructure at all, except they make Ed's buses a little late on the bus stops. So I would welcome that kind of innovation. I would welcome other kinds of innovation. I think we've got to get our mojo back here in the Bay Area. We've got a problem that most people in the nation would kill to have, which is we got too much money coursing around our region. I think that's a problem we can solve.
Okay, excellent. I would just add that I think I'm mostly where you are, Steve. I do think the equity issue has got to be addressed, that we have left communities of color and low-income communities in general, and the middle class is now in that category in this area in the successful mode, and I think some of the tweaks that you're talking about need to be put together. There's no silver bullet, but I think we need a game plan that addresses those to meet the challenge of success that we have. With that, let's give our panel a round warm of approval.